Welcome everyone. Thank you so much for joining us here at Smithsonian Science How. We have a really special guest today. She is a linguist and curator of linguistics here at the Smithsonian's National Museum of Natural History. We're joined by Dr. Gabriela Pérez Báez. Gabriela, thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you very much for the opportunity.
We've never had a linguist on our program, so we're really excited to learn about what one is and how you study language. So let's start there by having you tell us what exactly a linguist is.
Well, a linguist is someone who studies how humans use language, what diversity exists in languages of the world, and what that tells us about who we are as humans.
And so why is studying languages important?
Well, because language is quite unique to the human species. There's a lot of information that is encoded in language, information about how human groups have survived over time, and about how our brain processes language.
So it seems like we can learn an awful lot by actually studying these languages.
Absolutely.
Gabriela, we have an opportunity to let our viewers chime in with a live poll, so let's tune in to them. Viewers, here's an opportunity to participate in a live poll. Think about what Gabriela told us about studying languages and tell us what can we learn by analyzing language. About proper grammar, about brain processes, about structure of languages, or about the diversity of languages. We're watching your answers come in live as we sit here, and we see that 67% of our viewers have responded that analyzing language reveals diversity of languages. What do you think?
Well, I think your viewers are learning quickly about what linguistics is. We indeed, as linguists, focus heavily on trying to understand how many languages there are around the world, how they are similar, how they are different. We don't so much focus on proper grammar, because what we actually want to do is analyze language as it is naturally spoken and not in any particular style that is prescribed.
That makes me feel better about presenting today here with you. It takes a little bit of the edge off.
Sure.
So, Gabrielle, can you tell us exactly what defines a language or language?
Sure. Well, language is the ability to communicate to a group of people in such a way that we all understand a particular message. A language is a particular system in which we use sound or gesture or both, and we structure elements in such a way that we can communicate a message. The concept of a language is a little bit of an abstract notion, because, for example, we can talk about English or Spanish as being languages, but at the same time there are significant differences between the different Englishes or Spanishes that are spoken.
So how many languages are there in the world? Actually, I'm sure you know this answer, but before you tell us, let's actually check in with our viewers again. Sure. Viewers, here's another opportunity to chime in and tell us what you think. Tell us, how many languages are there in the world? Fewer than 20, 100 to 200, about 2,000, or more than 5,000? So we can see the results again. In more than 50%, 53% of our viewers think that there are more than 5,000 languages.
Well, again, our viewers seem to know quite a bit about languages, and there are indeed not only above 5,000, but we know there are more than 7,000 languages around the world.
Wow, that's huge. So where are all of these languages located and spoken?
Well, they are distributed not necessarily evenly around the world, but we know, for example, that there's huge density in of languages or of linguistic diversity in Papua New Guinea, which is not necessarily a huge area of the world, but there are a lot of different languages belonging to different language families. We know that the Americas has the greatest diversity, meaning that there's the largest number of distinct language families in this continent.
So if there's over 7,000 languages, does that stay the same, or are these languages actually changing with people? I know that we're adding words to the English dictionary all the time. I mean, 10 years ago I never would have said, or maybe 20 years ago, I never would have said that I texted my mom or I Googled linguistics.
Sure. Languages change constantly over time. We as humans like to be as efficient as possible, and communication is really crucial to our survival, so we want to be as efficient as we can. And when we find new ways of saying things or conveying a message, then we know we might go implement that strategy, which then gets shared, and we all start using language differently. And the reason why we have so many languages is because initial proto-languages or languages that are more ancient, such as Latin, eventually have changed because of population movements and have given way to many other languages.
So I'm still trying to grapple with the idea of languages sounding different, even if they're the same. So for example, I speak American English in particular. I live in Washington, D.C., but the English that I speak can sound different to somebody who may live in the South or somebody that lives in Australia. What defines where a language starts and stops and when it's a new language?
That's a tricky question. And as linguists, we actually spend a lot of time trying to figure out, is this particular system a dialect of a particular language, or is it can we consider it a separate language altogether? But indeed, what you're referring to with regards to English probably relates to both the notion of accent and dialect. So an Australian English might be a dialect of English, just as English from the Northeast coast would be another dialect of English.
Interesting. So what about people who speak multiple languages? You mentioned that there are over 7,000 languages worldwide. So does that mean that it's common to speak multiple languages or just one?
Well, humankind has been multilingual throughout its history, and we still see it today in the world. It is rather the norm to speak more than one language rather than just one.
And we see this dog here, looks like he's multilingual.
Yes. and you know, what happens is that we might live close to other groups of people who speak different languages, and we'll need to trade with them, cooperate, and that requires that we all speak you know, common systems. Also, there might be cultures that prescribe, for example, linguistic exogamy, which means that you need to marry someone from a different language group, which means that then your child will be exposed to two different languages, but that child will also look to marry someone in another group and will have to learn another language, and will be playing around throughout childhood with children who have different inventories of languages in their brains.
Can children do that? Do they get confused if they're being around multiple languages at once?
Well, the child's brain has a what we call brain plasticity, which means that the brain is shaped as a function of the input, the stimuli that the child receives. So if a child is exposed to 2, 3, 4 languages, which is not unusual, the child will be able to catalog all the input that he or she is receiving, learn how to store it in his or her brain, and also learn which system needs to be used depending on whether you're talking to the mom or the friend or the father. So children are by nature in a very good position to learn more than one language at a time.
That's really exciting. It seems like we can and all could be multilingual. Sure. Now, what about the argument that everything would be easier if everyone just spoke the same language? I've heard it before. What are your thoughts?
I've heard it before too. And the thing is that it's actually impossible that we would all 7 billion people speak the same language, and simply because of the dynamics of language, the fact that it changes quickly and constantly. So within a couple of generations, we would all be speaking differently anyway. But the other thing is that if we all spoke one single system, we would lose the ability to learn from the diversity, from the different structures that different languages present, and from the different information about that particular group that the language encodes. So we would lose a lot of information.
Yeah, it seems like a lot's at stake if we lose linguistic diversity and even just special and individual languages themselves. Absolutely.
And again, if we are not able to see how different languages are structured, we might think that all languages would look the same and that our brain is limited to a particular type of system.
So we see a graphic here now that's labeled endangered languages. It looks like there are a lot of endangered languages worldwide.
Yes, indeed. And this is a problem that has emerged over the last couple hundred years, especially. And out of the 7,000 plus languages in the world today, it is possible that at least half of them will go silent by the end of this century.
Wow, that would be a huge loss considering all of it you've told that's encoded in a language and its importance in our communities. So thank you for giving us an introduction to linguistics and language. We have some student questions coming in, so let's take a look.
Sure.
This one comes in from Vera. Why do you study language?
Thank you, Vera, for that very nice, interesting question. I study it because, again, we all speak language, or gesture, if you use a sign language, and we do it very naturally. But it turns out that the structure of a language is very, very complex, and it fascinates me that we as linguists can spend our entire professional life trying to figure out how a particular language is structured, and yet a little child who's 2 or 3 years old is figuring it out on the go.
Very cool. So we have a question from Victor in Maryland. This one is coming in Spanish. Remember, you can submit questions in Spanish. How about you respond in Spanish and then in English for us?
Absolutely. La pregunta de Víctor, muchas gracias. ¿Es la Internet culpable de la extinción de los idiomas? Yo diría que no, porque incluso el Internet ahora está siendo utilizado para presentar, para darles cabida a los idiomas del mundo, no al grado que quisiéramos, pero cada vez más vemos más lenguas presentes en el Internet. For English viewers, the question from Victor in Maryland is the Internet to be blamed for the extinction of languages? And my answer to that very interesting question is that the Internet is actually more and more being utilized as a domain of use of languages of the world. So we see more and more languages present there, probably not yet at the rate that we would like it, but they're coming and being displayed in the Internet more and more.
Great questions. Keep them coming. We have another question, but this one comes in by video, so let's have a look.
At what point is a language considered threatened?
The question was from Karen, and she wants to know at what point is a language considered threatened?
Thank you, Karen, for the question. That's a very important question. We consider a language to be threatened once children are no longer using a language as their preferred language. And that is because then if it's not a preferred language, when they grow older and have their own kids, they are not going to be using the language with the kids. And then the population of speakers of the language does not get renewed and starts to decrease.
This one's from Jack, and it comes in Spanish.
Gracias, Jack. ¿Qué idioma has hablado toda su vida y cuántos idiomas sabes? Bueno, mi lengua materna es el castellano, pero también aprendí el inglés a los 6 años y hablo francés. Estudio lenguas zapotecas, en particular una de la cual hablaremos, que se llama Dijazá. La conozco bastante bien, puedo defenderme en el mercado, pero no es una lengua que todavía, que aún puedo hablar ampliamente. So the question for our English viewers is, what language have I spoken throughout my life, and what languages do I know? And the answer is that Spanish is my mother tongue, and I learned English when I was 6 and later learned French, so I'm fluent in those 3. I also study Zapotec languages, and one in particular, Dijazá. I know it very well. I can defend myself at the market, but it's not yet a language that I can converse comfortably in.
Thank you for all the wonderful questions. Gabriela, let's learn more about your research. You just started talking a little bit about a Zapotec language that you study. I know that you do a lot of work in Mexico. Is there a lot of language diversity in Mexico?
There's tremendous linguistic diversity in Mexico. There are 11 language families in Mexico, and each breaks down into a lot of branches. So we have 68 language groups.
Wow.
And each of them will break down into more branches.
So I see Zapoteco. That's
yes.
one that you study?
Right. So Zapotec belongs to the Oromanguean stock of languages in Mesoamerica. It's a huge, similar, you can compare it to Indo-European in that it's a huge group of languages. You can see a branch that breaks into Zapotecan, then Zapotecan Chatino, which are what we call coordinate branches. And within Zapotec, You see Central Zapotec, and within it, there's a lot of several languages, and in there is Dijaza.
So you study Dijaza.
Correct.
Now, what interests you in Dijaza to study it?
Well, I'm very interested in the sound systems. The Zapotec languages, like 60% or more languages of the world, are tonal languages, which means that you can pronounce a vowel at different pitch levels, and that changes the meaning of the word. And also they have vowel phonation, which means that you can close and modulate the flow of air with your vocal cords to change the meaning of a word.
So we have a small audio clip here. Maybe we can take a listen to see if we can hear what you're talking about.
Sure.
Kanikegannala, rirendaka, chibaka, riabaka, rinitika. Orali chindouro abiciaro, guzananda kalustu babiri.
So I can hear what you're saying with the changes in tone throughout that brief segment that we heard, and it sounds very foreign to me.
Sure. Well, English is not tonal, and English doesn't use vowel phonation in a way to change meaning, whereas in Dijaza and other Zapotec languages, a word like ye with no glottal closure and ye are two different words.
So what else is unique about Dijaza?
I am, as a semanticist, I'm very interested in how meaning gets conveyed, and what that means about your brain processes. I'm very interested in how speakers of Dijaza talk about the space around them, and how they think about space as well. So we have an example here. There's a photograph of a chair and a ball, and if I were to ask you where is the ball, what would you say?
I would say the ball is to the right of the chair.
So, and that's what most English speakers would say, and speakers of Spanish and Japanese and Dutch. But speakers of Dijaza would describe this in relation to cardinal points, and they would say something like "Nuti bola nesaria zubija," which means there is a ball on the east side or to the east side, because they are not orienting space in relation to their body. That rather they're using a different system. And this is important because up until the 1970s, it was assumed that because of the way our bodies are built, we all humans necessarily have to orient space in relation to our bodies. But now, by studying languages like Dijaza, we have learned that there are other ways of speaking, but also of thinking about space.
That's a really good example of how knowledge is really encoded in a language.
Exactly.
So where is Dijaza spoken?
Dijaza, as many other Zapotec languages, is spoken in the state of Oaxaca in the south of Mexico. There are a few Zapotec languages in the state of Veracruz, which you see outlined in the map. And where you see Juchitán all the way in the south, in the Isthmus of Tehuantepec, is where you find Dijaza. It is spoken in 22 municipalities in that region.
And how many people does that represent?
So there are about 70,000 to 100,000 speakers of the language, which makes it the Zapotec language with the largest number of speakers. However, we're finding that children are speaking the language less and less, and at this point the language is considered endangered.
So what threats to Dijaza are there posed that would make it endangered? Why aren't people speaking it anymore?
Well, there's a great deal of pressure to speak Spanish. There are discriminatory practices that make people uncomfortable speaking their own native language. The schools are primarily teaching in Spanish, which prevents children from having enough input in the language, which, as I mentioned earlier, is very important. So those are several factors that are contributing to the problem.
Now, as a linguist, you are working on revitalizing the Dijaza language, and we're going to learn about how you're doing that in a moment, but we're going to give our viewers another opportunity to check in with us and tell us how you would revitalize an endangered language. Tell us, would you write a dictionary? Would you stop it from changing? Don't let people speak another language, or respect people's language choices? Tell us, how would you help sustain an endangered language? Our viewers are still voting, but 58% say that they would write a dictionary.
Fantastic. That's what I do for a living.
Tell us about your dictionary project.
Well, so Dijaza has had a couple of vocabularies written, one of them by a native speaker, and that was in the 70s. And I have, through a project, I got involved in documenting the language. It is now a dictionary with 12,000 entries. You see one here that documents a verb. It's still in a very technical stage, not terribly accessible yet for non-linguists, but we'll get to that point. And I have worked with about a dozen, more than a dozen speakers at this point to try to get their input. We've been able to, we've had focus heavily on plants because out of the 12,000 entries, there's about 1,000 that are plant-related terms. And they used to be very messy in the past. We see here a screen about a term, yagalagitu, which I thought referred to one tree. But then I kept getting a lot of information from speakers that made me think that they were several trees. And so it took about a year of documentation of all of the flora and as many names in Zapotec as possible to try to figure out what these trees were about. And as we can see, there are several trees with very different properties, but what they have in common is their architecture, how they branch out, and that is what makes them all fall into a category of trees called yagalagitu.
So it was kind of like that Y that we saw in
Yes.
that branch. Interesting. And that took a lot of research with a lot of locals and botanists.
Yes, so I'm a linguist, so I didn't really know what botanists know about documenting plants, but I happen to be at the National Museum of Natural History, and I'm very lucky in that I can talk to expert botanists who taught me a great deal about how to document. We see Vicky Funk in pink in the photo. And I also work with botanists in Mexico. We see on the left Alberto Reyes from the National Herbarium in Mexico, and there was Kenia Velasco as well in some of the photos, who you see there in pink. We also worked with several knowledge bearers from the community who generously shared what they know about plants.
Now, why did you start with plants? Is there some kind of information encoded in specific plant names that you were looking to get?
Well, I didn't necessarily start with plants. I had already gotten a lot of documentation of all kinds for the dictionary, but plants were not adequately documented. I had things like, well, here's the name of a cactus, and the definition was something along the lines of, it's a cactus that grows in the hills. And as you might imagine, there are many of those. So we needed to have more specificity, how many species are named with this particular Zapotec name, and what is important about that plant. Why is that plant named and not others? And that's because there's a cultural relevance, and there's because there has been an important interaction between the society and the plant, and that's why it gets a name.
So how are you giving this information back to the community of speakers? You're working on sustaining this language, so how does the community start learning Dijaza again?
Sure. As you might have seen in the screenshot of the dictionary, the documentation we do as linguists can be very, very technical, and we need to tweak it so that it becomes more accessible to those who are not linguists. We have produced materials, educational materials, that you just saw on the screen, so that the documentation is presented to the community with a grant from the Smithsonian Institution and with the support of the Recovering Voices Initiative, which is where I do most of my work. We were able to produce these very high quality materials for distribution free of charge to schools and cultural centers in the region.
Do you work with the schools directly?
I have been able to deliver materials, and some of my collaborators have also helped in the distribution. And what we just saw is a bingo game version of the documentation, which on the reverse has all of the documentation about the plants, but then children can play and learn about the plants that way.
That sounds very interesting. Gabriela, thank you so much for giving us an introduction to your work and how you're working to learn about and sustain Dijaza. Now, you've really sold me on the importance of understanding language and respecting language choice, but is it important for other non-linguists to really respect language choice and understand how valuable linguistic diversity is?
Absolutely. And in the poll, we had the option of respecting people's language choices. And most people are not linguists. And as non-linguists, you can actually have a very strong impact in linguistic diversity if you respect the language choices that people make, if you respect what a mother and a child might choose to speak to each other, because then that gives them the freedom to comfortably speak that language.
So important. So what's in your future? I know that you are a very busy woman. Just next week, you're collaborating with the Library of Congress, the Recovering Voices program, and the National Museum of American Indian to hold the Breath of Life conference.
Yes, so I'm a core member of the Recovering Voices initiative here at the Smithsonian Institution, which is the institutional response to the problem of language endangerment. And for us, it's really critical to make our collections, our institutional collections, accessible and to work collaboratively with communities in such a way that what the resources in the institution are made available to them in a way that contributes to their language revitalization efforts. The National Breath of Life Archival Institute for Indigenous Languages brings community researchers to the Smithsonian Institution and our partners to receive training in linguistic analysis and carry out hands-on research on archival materials so that they can recover knowledge about their languages that can then inform their revitalization efforts.
Sounds like really vital work. In the Recovering Voices program that you work on, what's your work with the Recovering Voices initiative in the future?
So, well, the Breath of Life Institute, this is the 4th year that we're holding it, so it's a priority activity of Recovering Voices. And we also work one-on-one with communities, groups of community researchers who we are able to bring to the museum so that they can carry out research either in the collections or the archives, and again, for the purposes of recovering knowledge about their languages and cultures and knowledge systems.
Gabriela, thank you so much for helping us better understand your work here today. So last question, Dennis wants to know how to become a linguist.
Fantastic. You want to become a linguist? Come talk to me. So I think the best thing to do is to, if you're in high school, middle school or high school, to start reading about the diversity of languages. There are a lot of resources online, such as the Endangered Languages Catalog, that can teach you about that. And then when you go to college, take a linguistics major.
Gabriela, thank you so much for being here today and helping us understand a little bit more about your work here at the Smithsonian. And thank you, viewers, for all your wonderful questions. Can you tell our viewers where they can learn a little bit more about the work you do?
Sure. You can learn about the work of Recovering Voices by going to recoveringvoices.si.edu. All the resources coming from the ethnobotanical research that I talked about is in the National Ethnobotanical Herbarium Online, which is at neho.si.edu. And you can learn about the National Breath of Life Archival Institute at nationalbreathoflife.org.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for being here today, Gabriela.
Thank you for the opportunity.
You can find all of those resources also on curious.si.edu. Thank you so much for being here today. We hope that you join our next broadcast. If you missed part of this broadcast, it will be archived later this evening at curious.si.edu. We hope to see you next time on Smithsonian Science House.